The Haunted Mansion at Disneyland isn't missing its thousandth ghost. It's missing something else entirely. Something the Imagineers never talked about. Something we're not supposed to see. Because while the mansion is filled with illusions, its real silence comes from what's not there. Just a southern mansion with no past. It wasn't until 2023 that I realized Disneyland's Haunted Mansion is modeled after a real 19th century estate, a real place from a complicated history. And yet, there's no mention of where it came from, just atmosphere. This isn't just about one ride. This is about how we tell ghost stories, what we include, what we leave out, and what we build our nostalgia on. So today, on Legacy of Folktales, we're going to walk through Disneyland's Haunted Mansion, not to see what's inside, but to ask what's missing, and why that matters more than ever. In 1966, Walt Disney unveiled a new land at Disneyland, New Orleans Square. No rides, just cobblestones, jazz, pirate storefronts, the only attraction, an arcade. Before the ghost arrived, before the pirates sailed, Disneyland bet everything on atmosphere. And at the bend of the river, a house appeared, white columns, shuttered windows. The Haunted Mansion's facade was directly inspired by the Shipley Lydecker House, a real antebellum estate from Baltimore. It had tall, white columns, a wraparound porch, and all the charm of the Old South, but none of the history that made that charm possible. And look, I get it. It's a theme park ride, but that's the point. Theme parks shape how we remember things, not by telling us what happened, but by letting us forget what did. Especially when the architecture is real and the silence around it is intentional. That's not projection, that's pattern. I didn't fully see it. Not until Splash Mountain was scheduled for removal, but right next to it, the Haunted Mansion, untouched, revered, beloved. That was the first time I realized the Haunted Mansion and Splash Mountain, though created decades apart, both rides draw from romanticized depictions of the American South, one through architecture, the other through folktales, and both omit the deeper historical realities behind those images. And no one said a word, because the Haunted Mansion wasn't designed to look scary. It was designed to look elegant, safe, and Walt was clear about that.
Disneyland has always had a big river and a Mississippi sternwheeler. It seemed appropriate to create a new attraction at the bend of the river. And so Disneyland's New Orleans Square came into being. A New Orleans of a century ago when she was the gay Paris of the American frontier. Of old New Orleans of the 1850s has been retained.
New Orleans Square draws heavily from romanticized images of the antebellum South, particularly its ironwork, balconies, and charm, not its full history. That's what became magic. But memory is not neutral, and nostalgia, it edits. We grew up thinking magic was the goal, but maybe the goal was comfort, and maybe comfort always comes with a cost. That house was a ghost long before the ride opened. Disneyland is more than fantasy. It's architecture built on memory, and sometimes forgetting. Every brick, every lamppost, every curve in the path is intentional. The trees are trimmed to block the outside world, streets curved gently so you never see too far ahead, buildings shrink toward the top, a trick of the eye to make them feel taller. A train runs a perimeter like a soft boundary, circling the park in imagination. These all create sight lines, quiet tools to shape how we feel. Not through force, through comfort. And all of it is in service of one feeling. Nostalgia. That warm arc for something we can't quite name but always want to return to. Walt once said,
I felt that there should be something built, some kind of an amusement enterprise built where that the parents and the children could have fun together.
And it worked. Disneyland wasn't just fun. It felt familiar, like stepping into a memory. But whose memory are we walking through? Walt Elias Disney spent formative years in the South, a place steeped in steamboats, frontier myths, Civil War memory. You can almost imagine he remembered the smell of river water, the sound of Dixieland jazz. He wasn't recreating fantasy, he was recreating his childhood, his America, the version that made him feel safe. Walt lived in Marceline, Missouri for just a few years. His father tried to work a farm. It didn't last, but the memory did. That version of America stayed with him, and one day he built it. But memory isn't always gentle. In 1938, Walt bought his parents a house with the profits from Snow White. Weeks later, his mother, Flora, died from a gas leak in the home, a flaw traced back to workers from his own studio. He was devastated, and for the rest of his life, he refused to speak about it. Maybe that was Walt's first haunted house, a beautiful home filled with love, suddenly marked by tragedy. So when he built Disneyland, he wasn't just designing rides. He was designing a memory you could walk through. A curated past where nothing had to be questioned, only enjoyed. So what happens when that memory takes the shape of a house? A house with white columns, a wraparound porch, iron railings, shuttered windows. Not scary, not crumbling, beautiful, familiar. The haunted house didn't look like a fairy tale. It looks like history. And maybe that's why it works so well. Not because it's haunted, but because it's remembered. What if the haunted mansion doesn't just help us escape death? It helps us forget the stories forgotten in houses like this in the first place. We thought the ghosts were the point, the swirling spirits, the hatbox illusion, but maybe the real question was never what's inside the haunted mansion. Maybe it's what isn't. There's lore here. Of course there is. A murderous bride, a stretching room, but even with all that, it still doesn't feel like a Southern ghost story. But even the bride has changed over time. What began as a flickering figure with hollow eyes, like the brown lady of Random Hall, became something else entirely. Not a grieving widow, but a smirking killer. Disney turned sorrow into satire, and something got lost in the laughter. The Haunted Mansion is pristine. It's Gothic in style, but not in weight. Not in the way the South tells ghost stories. Not in the way grief lingers. That's not Southern Gothic. That's Disneyland Gothic. Aesthetic hauntings carefully arranged. And maybe that's the missing piece. A deeper kind of haunting. The kind that stays with you. And now, just a few steps away, we're getting Tiana's Bayou Adventure. A new kind of magic. A new kind of story. What if the Haunted Mansion changed too? There's a version of this story Disney never told, and we didn't either. But the full unedited version is available now on our Patreon. In 2023, I walked through Disneyland with fresh eyes. Splash Mountain was about to close, but the Haunted Mansion, just next door, remained untouched. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but the longer I stood there, the more it started to feel like a pattern. Both the Haunted Mansion and Splash Mountain were built on stories from the American South. One made uncomfortable history feel playful, the other made uncomfortable architecture feel elegant. And that contrast, it didn't make me angry, it made me curious. Curious about what we preserve and what we quietly let fade. That's why I started Legacy of Folktales, because memory isn't just what we inherit, it's what we choose to keep telling. In the Haunted Mansion, it tells a beautiful ghost story. But sometimes I wonder, what if the real ghost is not inside the ride? What if it's been hiding in plain sight, in the architecture, in the silence? If Southern mansions are going to be haunted houses, then we have to ask, what are they haunted by? Because the ghosts inside the ride, they sing, they dance, they throw a party, but the house itself stays silent. And somehow, that silence says more than any ghost ever could. I kept wondering if there was something I wasn't supposed to notice. There's a story Disney doesn't tell, not in the Haunted Mansion, not even in its fairy tales. It's the story of what happens after grief. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, private kind. The kind you try to fix by building something beautiful. Walt Disney lost his mother in a tragic accident, a furnace leak in the home he bought her. She never lived to see Disneyland. According to biographers, Walt rarely, if ever, spoke publicly about his mother's death. a loss that left a profound mark. But what if that silence left an echo? The Southern Gothic genre is famous for this kind of silence. Beautiful ruins that never name the decay, families that don't talk about what happened in the attic. It's a storytelling tradition built not just on memory, but on what we choose to forget. And for years, the attic held a bride with a mischievous grin, Constance Hatchaway, who seemed to outlive every one of her husbands.
I did.
But in 2025, something shifted. Walt Disney Imagineering quietly replaced her with the figure from the past, the beating heart bride, one that feels more like a ghost story than a punchline. The new bride is spectral and somber, holding a candelabra with the glowing red heart pulsing in her chest. According to Imagineer Kim Irvine, they wanted to bring back the feeling of a lost bride in the attic, mourning the loss of her husband. And it shows. She floats beside fading portraits, not with a smirk, but with sorrow. The joy is gone, the party is over, and something more haunting has taken its place. Maybe this is the beginning of something deeper, a moment of stillness and a ride known for gags and glow-in-the-dark ghosts. That kind of grief that doesn't scream, it lingers. That kind of memory the Southern Gothic stories are built on. Because we know this silence. The ghosts here aren't vengeful, they're funny, smiling. They're a gift shop at the end, and Walt didn't live to see any of it. New Orleans Square was one of the last things he ever saw finished. What was inside the mansion would be decided later. Finished by Imagineers still grieving, moving forward, because that's what Americans were taught to do. After World War II, America didn't just want peace, they wanted comfort, wholesomeness, and Disneyland became part of that, a place to remember the past without remembering the pain. What if the Haunted Mansion isn't missing a ghost? What if it's missing a memory of the South? And the silence in its halls isn't the sound of death, it's the sound of what we never let ourselves say. But here's the twist. Disney Gothic didn't start with the Haunted Mansion. It started 36 years earlier in a graveyard full of laughing skeletons. In 1929, decades before Disneyland, Walt Disney released the Skeleton Dance. 4 skeletons rise from their graves to dance and xylophone each other's bones before rushing back into the earth at dawn. It's funny, it's morbid, and it's straight out of a medieval tradition called the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. During the Black Plague, Europeans coped with mass death by staging plays and paintings of skeletons dancing with peasants, priests, and kings. A reminder that we all end up the same. Prince and pauper, mouse and skeleton. Disney didn't just inherit this tradition, he reinvented it for animation, and the audience loved it. The skeleton dance became a Halloween hit, and with it, Disney's silly symphonies were born. So no, the Haunted Mansion wasn't an outlier. It was part of a much older tradition, a quieter one, a genre scholars now called Disney Gothic, where grief, playfulness, and the grotesque all hide beneath a smile.
You're going to meet the ghosts. This is a little scale model now of the Disneyland area. You've seen this many times, but we haven't got the ghosts in there yet. But we're out collecting the ghosts.
In the earliest drawings from 1951, artists like Harper Goof and Dale Hennessy sketched traditional Victorian homes, classic silhouettes of American horror. Then, in 1957, Walt brought in Ken Anderson to design a full walkthrough. Anderson's first mansion was darker, even tragic, but when Walt settled on New Orleans Square, everything changed. Anderson redrew the house in a clean antebellum style, inspired by Shipley Lydecker House, a southern home without decay. So how did Disneyland's eeriest ride end up looking like a southern mansion on the outside, but feeling like a Halloween party on the inside? The answer? 2 men, and a creative tug-of-war. Claude Coates was a background artist. He wanted the ride to feel eerie, a long corridor of stretching shadows, lightning at the windows. Mark Davis was an animator. He wanted jokes, ghosts sipping tea. And instead of picking one, Disney chose both. That genre whiplash, spooky but silly, became the mansion's signature tone. But it may have done something else too. It softened the edges. It let the house feel playful instead of tragic. Because by the time the ghost arrived, you've already forgotten what the house looks like. And that's the sleight of hand. Of course, the Haunted Mansion avoided its own history. That's how American horror works. We don't confront the places that are truly haunted, we joke our way through them. And in that way, the Haunted Mansion is perfect. A fantasy where the architecture's deeper history goes unmentioned.
Then you tell me what you see. Now, peek in there. What do you see?
Organ?
What's going on?
It's playing.
Yes.
A ghost.
A ghost is playing, sure. What kind of a ghost?
A skeleton ghost.
Yeah, well, we have all kinds of ghosts, you know. Okay. Now you believe, I hope.
Haunted houses weren't always part of pop culture. They didn't even exist as a ride until 1915. And they didn't become popular until the Great Depression. But once they did, they exploded. In a time of financial ruin, Americans started to romanticize the past. Gone with the Wind turned southern estates into paragons of beauty, and haunted houses turned Victorian mansions into sites of dread. These early attractions were creaky and mechanical, but beneath the gimmicks was something deeper, a fear of the past, lingering into the present. Now, if you've seen our last video, you know that Gothic literature played a big part in helping to make the Victorian mansion a site of dread. In that era, haunted houses weren't about ghosts, they were about decay, once grand homes abandoned. It's no coincidence that these were Victorian homes, opulent, chaotic, and suddenly untrustworthy. Because in the shadow of economic collapse, the elite became ghosts in their own mansions. That's what made those homes scary. Not what was inside them, but what they represented. And that's why Disney's Haunted Mansion feels so strange, because it doesn't borrow from those crumbling Victorian ruins. It doesn't look like a haunted house. It looks kind of dreamy. And that wasn't an accident. Walt Disney didn't want decay in Disneyland. He wanted elegance, a kind of fantasy where memory was beautiful, even if history wasn't. But a southern estate feels different. It can't just be a house, it's a marker of what happened. And that makes it more than a backdrop, it becomes a whole sidebar of its own. And in that way, the Haunted Mansion became a time capsule, a snapshot of horror in the 1960s, teetering between what we feared and what we refused to name, full of ghosts, but still avoiding the real ones. Popular family-friendly ghost stories of the time were The Addams Family and The Munsters, two TV shows that found ways to confront America's social anxiety right after the Civil Rights Movement with comedic images of the other. And just when you think it's all jokes and makeup, The Munsters quietly delivers one of the most compassionate lines about difference in TV history.
It doesn't matter what you look like. You can be black or yellow or white. It doesn't matter. What does matter is the size of your heart.
That tension between eerie and absurd wasn't just a Disney problem. Around the same time the Haunted Mansion was being designed, another story hit the screen, which actually makes an appearance in the Haunted Mansion. Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, a southern estate, a fading vision, a secret she can't escape. Bette Davis plays a character unraveling in real time, surrounded by memories no one will speak of. The past is clawing its way out, and off-screen, the feud between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford threatened to destroy the production. Two stars, both clinging to an image of power, now trapped in a story about decay. That's what Southern Gothic does. It doesn't just haunt its characters, it lets them rot. And if you look closely, the Haunted Mansion stretching room references Joan Crawford herself. The imagery is there, but the feeling sanitized. In fact, this image was inspired by this other image from the set of Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte. The twist being, Joan Crawford would not see the end of production. The Haunted Mansion borrows the visual, but skips the madness, skips the grief. Because the truth is, Disney could have gone full Southern Gothic. Charlotte showed them how, but instead they kept the elegance and left the pain on the cutting room floor. But back to what we were saying. Walt didn't want any decay at Disneyland. He wanted cleanliness, control, order for his ghosts. So the ghosts became jokes, the house became beautiful, and the memory of what it used to be, that disappeared altogether. The final Haunted Mansion wasn't designed for clarity, it was designed for compromise. 4 creative teams, dozens of ideas, all trying to agree on what the story should be. And maybe that confusion wasn't a failure. Maybe it was a turning point. The Haunted Mansion was the first time Disney stopped trying to top itself. No wow factor finale, just a house and a feeling. And somehow that genre confusion became the whole point. Some fans could see that tonal compromise, spooky but silly, as reflecting broader cultural hesitations of the era. Without Walt, the Imagineers didn't have a final voice to unify the story. But over time, that tension became the silly and the spooky, became its most iconic feature, a haunted house with no clear tone, just fragments, like a memory. Contrast that with the Phantom Manor in Paris. The story is unified. There's a reason Vincent Price was chosen to narrate. It's not just a ride, it's a requiem. Which brings us back to Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. If Disney had picked a tone, what if it chose grief instead of giggles, history instead of hauntings? Remember when we said Disneyland is a memory you can walk through? That memory has rules. The buildings don't decay. It's not just storytelling, it's simulation. French philosopher Jean Baudrillard once said Disneyland isn't fake to hide the truth. It's fake to convince us that the rest of America is real. It's not just a fantasy, it's a decoy, a simulation so immersive it distracts us from the fact that much of American life is already curated. Disneyland doesn't expose our illusions, it protects them. So maybe the Haunted Mansion isn't haunted by ghosts. Maybe it's haunted by everything we're told to forget. And nowhere is that clearer than New Orleans Square. Because when it opened in 1966, there were no rides, just atmosphere. Guests paid a dime to play make-believe in a southern port city. No IP, just curated memory. That arcade is gone now, but in its place, a restaurant so exclusive it cost over $100,000 to reserve. You dine above the ghosts of that arcade, surrounded by a city that is a simulation of another city that actually exists, curating the memory of the South without the struggle. And that's the escalation. The simulation is still here, but the deeper stories, those get quieter. The buildings remain, but the meaning fades. In the years leading up to the mansion's opening, Disney guests were conditioned to expect spectacle. Every year brought a new miracle. Mr. Lincoln, the Tiki Room, pirates. But when the Haunted Mansion opened in 1969, it didn't offer anything new in technology. And maybe that was the point. Maybe this was the ride where Disney stopped racing toward the future and turned inward, a place where memory stood still. The Haunted Mansion didn't open until 1969, but its construction began much earlier, in 1962. By 1963, the exterior was finished, a pristine white mansion nestled in the still under construction New Orleans Square. And then it sat empty. For years, guests passed by the house with no ride inside, no ghosts, no story, just columns and silence. Because Walt Disney had made a decision. He paused the mansion's development and sent his Imagineers to work on something else, the 1964 World's Fair. That decision would haunt the mansion forever because the fair wasn't just about rides, it was about narrative control. America had been using World's Fairs that way for decades. By 1964, Walt was using the fair to do something similar, but more advanced: audio animatronics, storytelling through simulation. Great moments with Mr. Lincoln, a robotic president, a speech about unity.
We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing.
What if that's true not just with words, but for places? What if a mansion? What if those mean different things too? For some, it's nostalgia. For others, it's something that never needed to become haunted because the memory was never buried. That's the challenge of building a memory in 3 dimensions. You can't control who walks through it, but you can choose what you invite them to remember. Because that's what Walt Disney does best. Not just remember, but recreate. And that vision of history, it began years earlier in a little antique shop in New Orleans, the real New Orleans. Walt and Lillian were visiting the city he loved. He found a mechanical bird in a gilded cage and bought it. When he got back to California, he asked his team, "Can we make it sing?" That tiny bird, barely able to chirp, would change everything. From it came the Tiki Room, then Lincoln, then Small World, then Pirates of the Caribbean, then the Ghosts. Disneyland didn't invent nostalgia, but it perfected it in 3 dimensions. And while the Imagineers built Lincoln for the fair, the mansion sat there in California, finished on the outside, empty inside. And maybe that was always the plan, because long before the guests arrived, the house had already become a monument to what we're willing to remember, and what makes the South a vision of the past. The Haunted Mansion could have been anything. Early plans showed it at the end of Main Street, something out of a Gothic horror, but a Victorian house. Creaky floorboards, broken banisters, a ruin. But Walt Disney did not want ruins. He wanted the house to be clean. So in 1963, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, Disneyland unveiled a white column mansion, antebellum on the outside, and who knows on the inside, because they hadn't finished it. And for 6 years, it sat there, empty, waiting. Some fans saw this delay as a missed opportunity, a ride left behind as other attractions raced forward. But others began to see something else. A house that sat empty for years, beautiful, finished, but hollow, a monument to indecision. And over time, that strange limbo became its own kind of genius. The mansion was a triumph of mood and contradiction. The ghost would come later, but the house? That house had already chosen its memory. It wasn't Gothic, it wasn't Victorian, it was decidedly Southern, architectural nostalgia stripped of its origin. Because in America, some memories whisper louder than facts, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The ghosts drink tea, they crack jokes, but the columns, they stay silent. The Haunted Mansion doesn't mention historic Southern mansions. It doesn't mention labor history. It doesn't mention the South. But it does use their architecture, and it surrounds that architecture with charm. That's not new for Disney. In 1939, inspired by the success of Gone with the Wind, Walt Disney licensed the works of Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus and Brer Rabbit Tales. These stories would form the basis of Song of the South, released in 1949.
A very favorite storyteller of ours, Uncle Remus, had another name for it. He called it a laughing plate.
These stories were reimagined through nostalgia, with much of their context removed. Song of the South would be the basis for Splash Mountain, and to this day, Song of the South is not available on Disney+. When Splash Mountain opened in 1989, Uncle Remus was gone. The story was altered, the characters stayed, but the context was changed. Interestingly, that same year, Glory became the first Civil War film centered on emancipation, a small shift in Hollywood. But Disney never quite went there. But what if they had? The Haunted Mansion isn't just a ride, it's a story we keep retelling. And each time, it reveals a little more. In 2003, Disney released its first Haunted Mansion movie, a goofy, spooky romp starring Eddie Murphy. But buried in that comedy was something no one expected, an interracial romance that couldn't survive antebellum custom, a ghost who died for love, a butler who sabotaged a wedding.
Your union was unacceptable.
So you killed her?
I told you it would be a mistake to run away with that girl.
But I loved her! Was love my mistake?
Yes!
A New Orleans mansion, a forbidden love, a silence that kills. Even in parody, the architecture still whispers. Then came the 2023 reboot. Bigger cast, better effects, a story of grief and memory, not just romance. Rosario Dawson, Lakeith Stanfield, Jamie Lee Curtis. The ghosts are metaphors. The priest is comedic relief. The seance is entertainment. Both films flirt with Southern Gothic. The 2003 version more explicitly, the 2023 version trades romance for grief, yet still avoids the architecture's legacy. Together, they circle the genre, but never quite step into it. It's as if Disney sees the silhouette of Southern Gothic, but flinches at the shadow. The irony is the architecture is already doing half the work. The ghosts just need permission to speak. In fact, even Disneyland's early restaurants were themed as nostalgic Americana. But these comforting facades weren't telling the full story, just the safe one. But this wasn't limited to one ride. In early Disneyland designs, Walt imagined a series of homes lining the rivers of America, inspired by real antebellum estates. You could sail past Andrew Jackson's Hermitage or George Washington's Mount Vernon, homes that once stood as symbols of political power, America, and wealth, now reimagined as architecture of charm. That vision didn't make it into the final park, but the memory of it lingered and possibly inspired the Haunted Mansion. Before you say, but this is Disney, they don't want to tell complicated stories. In the 1990s, Disney planned a theme park called Disney's America, a park that would explore US history, but almost immediately there was backlash. Critics feared Disney would sanitize painful parts of history, and the project was ultimately canceled amid mounting controversy. At Disneyland Paris, their version of the Haunted Mansion isn't pristine, it's derelict. Haunted by a grieving bride built atop a ghost town, it leans into a type of Gothic, almost Southern. The pain, the rot, the memory, they called it Phantom Manor, and it tells a story the original mansion never dared. A family legacy poisoned by guilt, a bride stuck between mourning and madness, a town swallowed by its own secrets. That's what Southern Gothic looks like when Disney lets the ghosts speak. Imagine if that were the story at Disneyland. Same columns, different silence. And maybe that's what haunts the Haunted Mansion. Maybe the mansion isn't haunted by spirits. Maybe it's haunted by what's missing. The Haunted Mansion borrows from some of the most iconic horror ever written. Not just the ghost, but the genre itself. Poe, Wilde, Shirley Jackson. But there's a part of that tradition we don't often look at too closely, because American Gothic has always had a shadow. Toni Morrison once observed that in American stories, darkness often exists not as a character, but as contrast, something to define the innocence around it. And it's not always obvious, but once you see it, you start to wonder who these haunted houses were built for, and who was left out of the story. Edgar Allan Poe helped define the genre, but even his most chilling tales rarely asked who built the walls, whose footsteps went unheard. You'll find a raven perched over a grave, but you won't find the labor that made those mansions possible. Southern Gothic followed that same blueprint, but rarely do these stories name the real histories underfoot. That's what made the genre feel eerie, a sense that something was missing and maybe still is. And maybe that's what makes the Haunted Mansion so powerful and so strange. It isn't just Gothic, it's inherited. It borrows the architecture, the atmosphere, even the silence. What if the Haunted Mansion doesn't just echo Gothic horror, it echoes its omissions too? Not to erase the past, to protect a kind of comfort without confronting where it came from. And once we realize that, we're no longer just walking through a ride, we're walking through a memory. You can learn a lot about a culture by how it designs a haunted house. In America, our ghosts are polite. They sing in barbershop quartets, but what happens when Disney leaves the country? In France, they let the house rot. Their version is called Phantom Manor, a Western-style ghost town swallowed by its own grief. In Hong Kong, there are no ghosts at all. That's not just a creative decision, it's cultural. Traditional Chinese beliefs carry deep taboos about the dead and the afterlife. So instead of building a haunted house, Disney invented Mystic Manor. Here, nothing dies. Instead, a magical music box brings artifacts to life. But then there's Japan. In Tokyo Disneyland, the Haunted Mansion is almost identical to Magic Kingdom's version. A little darker, a a little more stylized, but the bones are the same. And right next door, the last Splash Mountain on Earth. Two deeply American fantasies side by side, frozen in time. In France, the mansion decays. In Hong Kong, it never knew death. In Japan, it stayed preserved, like America in amber. But only in America do we build a pristine southern mansion and pretend nothing ever happened inside. Other countries adapted, but here, the facade remains untouched, haunted by silence. Something new arrived at Disneyland, Tiana's Bayou Adventure, a reimagining of Splash Mountain rooted in food, jazz, community, and joy. It's based on the 2009 film The Princess and the Frog, Disney's first Black princess. Set in 1920s New Orleans, the film was also a return to hand-drawn animation, a visual love letter to Disney's past. Remember the Disney Renaissance, Aladdin, Lion King, all drawn by hand, even as it pointed toward a different future. The music is infectious, the visuals are vibrant, the story, one of hope, and where does it sit? Right next to the Haunted Mansion. That contrast is striking. Well, technically, there's a carriage house in between the Haunted Mansion and Tiana's Bayou Adventure for Madame Leota's gift shop, but you get the drift. Again, one ride, Splash Mountain, now Tiana's Bayou Adventure, was reimagined. Another ride, the Haunted Mansion, left untouched. But for over 3 decades, the Haunted Mansion and Splash Mountain stood side by side. 2 rides, 2 visions of the South, telling a quiet story. But what if we didn't stop at reimagining rides? What if we reimagined memory? Picture this. It's Mardi Gras night. Tiana's friend, Charlotte, throws a party in her daddy's old home. Beads, music, masks, laughter spilling into the street. But upstairs, something waits. Older than the party, older than the house. A ghost not of the ride, but of the place. A Southern Gothic tale. Not about who did what, but why we still feel it. The kind of story where silence isn't protection, it's the trap. Where the past doesn't just haunt the house, it pulls you inside. Well, Disney has already shown they can do overlays. Nightmare Before Christmas transforms a Haunted Mansion every Halloween and Christmas, so why not Mardi Gras? Why not a story that embraces the music and the mourning, the beauty and the burden? Quentin Tarantino once said he loved spaghetti westerns because they let him look at the American West with fresh eyes, unafraid to confront the anti-heroes and history. Maybe the antebellum South could do the same.
And that would be, to me, to think of the antebellum South as a landscape would be the perfect American equivalent of the spaghetti western universe.
Not through revenge stories, but through an updated stylized Southern Gothic framework, a genre that doesn't flinch away from the past, but lets the ghosts finally speak. Not just to haunt us, but to remind us. And if Disney wanted to try, Mardi Gras would be a good place to start, with Tiana's story at the center. This park evolves. The question is, what do we want it to remember? What kind of memories do we want our kids to inherit? What kind of ghosts do we still protect? Maybe the ghost Disney's been missing has been here all along. And here's the wild part. The Haunted Mansion isn't just a Disneyland ride. There's even a Haunted Mansion cruise ship experience. And there are Facebook groups of people who've scattered ashes inside the ride, hoping their loved one becomes part of the story. If that doesn't tell us what this house means to people, what will? Because millions of people step into this mansion every year and never ask why it looks the way it does. What if we gave it permission to remember too? Maybe the Haunted Mansion was never missing its 1000th ghost. Maybe it was missing something harder to see, a truth buried in the walls. Disneyland is a curated dream of what America wants to remember and what it still refuses to name. And the Haunted Mansion, it tells us something about what happens when we build joy on top of history and paint over the cracks. Grief isn't what haunts us, forgetting is. But here's a twist. Maybe it's not just the Haunted Mansion that's haunted, maybe it's us, haunted by what we once saw and were told to forget. But the stories that made us feel safe, but taught us not to ask questions. So maybe the question isn't why hasn't the mansion changed? Maybe the question is, what could it become if we let it remember? Maybe the Haunted Mansion doesn't need a new ghost. Maybe it needs a new genre. One that doesn't smooth over the cracks, but lets the cracks tell the story. And if you want to see the story horror still won't touch, the one place scarier than any fictional haunted house, we made a whole video about it. Because if horror is about reckoning with the past, there's one kind of house it seems too scared to hunt.